So we're going to talk about cold storage disorders, fruits and vegetables. Why use cold storage? First of all, the shelf life of commodities is inversely proportional to their temperature, usually. So the lower the temperature, the slower the rate of respiration, the slower the metabolic processes that occur, and therefore the longer the shelf life. Respiration is halved for every 10 degrees Celsius drop in temperature. Okay? So if you have a temperature drop of 10 degrees, you have a doubling of shelf life. If you have an increase in 10 degrees, you have a halving of the shelf life. So instead of 2 weeks, you'd have 1 week of shelf life. Low temperatures reduce microbial growth, and low temperatures can also reduce water loss. Air at 10 degrees Celsius can hold twice as much water as air at 0 degrees. So as the cold air, we'll go into this a little later, okay. So here's some effective temperature on strawberries. You see here that these are sound fruit, and these are rotted fruit. If you have a continuous 48 hours at 5 degrees Celsius, you have about 95% of the fruit still good, but if that 48 hours was at 20 degrees Celsius, you know, when you bring the strawberries home or the blueberries home, put them in the refrigerator right away. Because even a few hours sitting out on the countertop will drastically reduce the quality of the strawberries over time, even if they're then put in the refrigerator. So here you see it drops from 95 to 44%. A really great reduction in the number of sound berries. Rotted berries that are very low at low temperatures, but of course they can increase to be almost half of them by warmer temperatures. So cold temperatures are really important in maintaining the firmness, the metabolic integrity of the commodity, and reduce microbial activity. Yeah. Okay, life and temperature and the Q10. All right. Life can exist at very great temperatures, right? You have all seen these programs where they have the algae that are growing in the thermal pools at Yellowstone, or the algae that are growing on the faces of the ice cliffs in Antarctica. So they can exist in a long way, but of course we're interested in commodities in an agricultural setting in a much narrower range of temperatures. And one of the ways we express the effective temperature on the metabolic rate and the activity of these commodities is by looking at the Q10. Okay? The Q10 is just a temperature quotient, and it's the rate of a reaction, whether respiration, energy production, temperature, etc., for a 10-degree rise or 10-degree fall in temperature. The Q10 is usually 1 for many chemical and physiochemical processes, but in living things it can be 2 to 3, and in some things like cut flowers, broccoli, and respiration, you can have 4 to 6. What does that mean? Well, that means that a 10-degree rise in temperature, say for asparagus, will be a 6-fold increase in the rate of respiration. And as the previous slide showed, this 6-fold increase in respiration will result in a 1/6 the shelf life. So these commodities are extremely sensitive to temperature fluctuations because of the very high Q10 values. Okay, so here we have temperature versus respiration rate, and this is in amount of CO2 produced. And as you can see, as the temperature goes up, the respiration goes up, but it doesn't go up linearly. It doesn't go up in a straight line. The higher the temperature, the greater the rate of increase, the faster it increases. Okay? We can also express this as heat production. So when you have some commodities in a cooler and you've designed it to remove so much heat, so many BTUs of energy, and all of a sudden you're holding things at a slightly warmer temperature, you're going to put a greater load on the refrigeration capacity of that room, okay? Because there's going to be more heat produced. And it goes up in a quadratic function, not a linear function. So how could we use this to calculate the Q10? Well, we can look at the temperature and the respiration rate, or this is heat production. So temperature, heat production. So at 15 degrees Celsius, we have 10 units of heat produced, right? Then we look at 5 degrees, and we notice that we have about what? 2.5, something like that. So 4, okay? So 4. So at 15 degrees, we have 10 units of heat production. At 5 degrees, we have 4 units of heat production. What's the Q10? There's a 10 degree temperature differential here. So what's the Q10? 2.5, right? 10 divided by 4, 2.5. So there's a temperature window for the storage of many products. We have a low temperatures and warm temperatures. We rarely ever see an effect because the temperature is too high. Okay? Usually temperatures, any adverse effect because of storage is because the temperature is too low. And the temperature, we have our freezing injury, when the things drop below 0 degrees Celsius and they freeze, or chilling injury, where the commodity is held at a lower temperature, and these are usually tropical and subtropical fruit, or fruit that were from the tropics and subtropics, like tomatoes. Right? Tomatoes are grown in the tropical part of the year because they're very sensitive to temperature, chilling temperatures. So we have the high temperature, like sun scald that occur, but that's rarely occurring in storage disorders. We have non-freezing temperatures, which are called chilling injury, and we have sub-zero temperatures, which are called freezing injury. Okay, problems with cold storage. Excessive water loss. How can you have excessive water loss when you're holding these things close to 0 degrees Celsius? Because the air coming off the coils is going to be at what relative humidity? Okay. You've got a great big bank of coolers up there, evaporators. You have the air coming off the evaporators. It's 0 degrees, coils are cold, 0 degrees air coming out. What's the relative humidity? It's going to be 100%, right? Because those coils are cold and the air coming into them from the room has condensed on them, and you get water condensing on the coils, and then it drips out. So the water coming out of that refrigeration unit is 100% relative humidity. But now it comes into a room and it starts to warm up. So as it warms up, the water holding capacity of the air increases, so the relative humidity does what? It decreases, right? So even though you're holding that room at 0 degrees Celsius, the air coming out of the evaporator is 100% relative humidity. Some of those commodities are experiencing 70% relative humidity. So they're being dried out by that air, even though it's really cold. Okay, it can cause freezing injury, and we'll talk about that quite a bit. And it can cause chilling injury, we'll talk about that. And chilling injury may be hidden. You'll never see it, but it may happen that the consumer sees it, right? Because it's kind of hidden sometimes. It takes sometimes for the symptoms to develop. And of course, if you have a closed room with all this refrigeration, you can have the increased concentration of CO2 and of ethylene. So here's a chart that we're all familiar with, right? Everybody know what this is? It's a psychrometric chart. And as we can see here, excessive water loss can occur because of low relative humidity. If the coil temperature is 0 degrees Celsius, 100% relative humidity there. The room temperature is 5, which is still a good storage temperature, right? So there you have 0 degrees coil, 5 degrees surface of the commodity because it's producing energy, producing heat. And you can see you have a vapor pressure deficit. There we go. So you have a vapor pressure deficit that develops there, and that then drives water evaporation from the commodity. So you lose water from the commodity, even though it's cold, even though the air coming off. How can you prevent that from happening? How could you prevent water loss under those conditions? It's really difficult to do because you have to raise the humidity in a room, and if you raise the humidity too much in the room, of course you get condensation. The packages start to deteriorate because most packages aren't really meant to be wet for a long time, so the boxes start to collapse. You have condensation on some of the commodities, and that fosters microbial growth. So oftentimes it's very difficult to maintain really high humidity under these conditions. Freezing injury. So that's water loss, freezing injury. Now, water in the cell, so you have a cell surrounded by a cell wall. And the cell wall looks like a basket. It's a woven material out of cellulose, microfibrils, and other compounds. But it's kind of porous, kind of open, kind of flexible, right? And there's water in there, and there's water inside the cell. Where is the water most concentrated? Inside the cell. Because inside the cell you have the proteins, you have the sugars, you have all these different things inside the cell. Outside the cell, in the cell wall, you have relatively pure water. Now, I grew up in Minnesota, and if you wanted to make really hard cider, you would take apple juice, ferment it, right? You'd get a few percentages of alcohol, and then what would you do to concentrate the alcohol? You'd put it out on the back step, and it would freeze. You know, this is in the winter. It would freeze. Now, what are those ice crystals made of? They're made of pure water. So if you have an ice crystal formed and it's pure water, what happens to the other solutes in that container? They get concentrated, right? So as the water in the cell wall, being the purest water, freezes first, the water outside the cell becomes more concentrated. And what does that do? Because of osmotic changes because of the concentration, you get a water movement out of the cell. The ice crystals cause the water in the cell wall to become more concentrated because they're removing pure water in the crystals. The cell wall contains a more concentrated solution. The water then is drawn out of the cells to the cell wall. This causes plasmolysis or dehydration of the cell. So cellular dehydration, not ice crystal formation, causes freezing injury. So here we have some ice crystals. Ice crystals form by the accretion of molecules on their surface. They don't grow, they only grow from the surface, right? So they can't exert any force. You often hear about these sharp ice crystals poking holes in the cell membrane, right? They're really sharp and they're going to poke holes in the membrane and start destroying the cells. They can't do that. It's just a crystal forming. As the water molecules start to cool and freeze, they accrete on the surface of the crystal and it grows larger, but it can't exert any force. There's a handout at each of your places where you sit, and this goes through in great detail, more than you'd probably want to know, in great detail about how freezing actually causes the damage. But you know, as water freezes, does it increase or decrease in volume? Increases in volume, the density goes down, right? That's why ice floats, right? So here you have water in the cell wall, you have ice crystal formation and more ice crystals. The temperature is -5 and there is -2. And as you can see, the ice volume increases a lot, but the total volume, the volume really increases only about 7% when ice crystals is done. So if it's in a rigid container, like a glass container or an iron pipe, that 7% increase can rupture that material. You can actually break an iron pipe by just freezing it. But remember, a cell wall is kind of plastic. It's like a basket, and it's not going to rupture when the ice freezes. It'll just be slightly modified in its shape. So it's not the physical formation of the crystals, it's not the sharpness of the crystals, it's the dehydration that causes the problem. Okay. Why does fruit tissue close to the pit freeze first and not tissue near the surface? So here we have some plums, and the freezing occurred near the pit, not in the flesh out here. How could that occur? How could that coldness penetrate the plum and freeze the center of it without freezing the surface first? Where are the solutes most concentrated in a plum? When you eat a plum, where is it sweetest? Outside on the peel, right? So you have more sugars out here in the peel, less sugars near the pit. Less sugars, it freezes first. The whole thing can be at the same temperature, but because of the greater sugar concentration in the pulp near the skin, it won't freeze, but the tissue near the seed, having a lower concentration of solute sugars, it will freeze first. So here you see a pear, for example, soluble solid content. It's 10.6 right here, so that would freeze before this. Flesh would freeze because it has a higher concentration of soluble solutes. So that's often kind of a problem when you have things that have frozen and all of a sudden you see the outer flesh is still good, but the inner part is frozen. Why? How could that happen? It's all because of the difference in soluble solids concentration. So freezing point depression, that's what it's called, and the solutes depress the freezing point of the material. Okay, here's some examples of freezing injury. You see waterlogging of the tissue collapse in the asparagus. Here you see some wilting up in there in the tissue and some discoloration occurring on the cauliflower. Now here you have a box of melons and you see freezing injury occurring here and here, but not in there. What happened? Yeah, it's a position of the material on the pallet. So this was in a corner of a pallet load, and they had the exhaust from the refrigeration unit hitting the side of the box. So these froze and these didn't, just because of the positioning of the box in the cold air. More examples of freezing injury here. We have waterlogging of tissue in these kiwi fruits. We have waterlogging here in corn and celery. White patches occur on celery and here on these sugar peas. So those are freezing injury. But okay, so that's freezing. That's actually when ice crystals form. Most fruits and vegetables are chilling tolerant. Okay. And you can see often things displayed like this where there's actual ice in the box, and they are very happy with that. But there is commodities that are chilling sensitive. Okay. It's a physiological disorder, not a pathological disorder, although the physiological disorder can manifest itself in greater microbial growth in the tissue. It develops usually after exposure. In cases where there's prolonged chilling, and it can occur during the chilling, but oftentimes it occurs after the chilling occurs. Okay? And there's often a critical temperature below which the things will be injured. The critical temperature is usually around 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But like African violets, they're very sensitive to chilling, and they'll be injured at around 55 degrees Fahrenheit or around 12 degrees Celsius. Severity depends on the temperature and the duration of exposure. And there's a critical threshold. Okay. So this critical threshold can sometimes be modified by growing conditions, selecting a different cultivar, or some pre-treatments can make the tissue more resistant to chilling. I've got some tomato plants growing outside, and what happens when the temperature during the night falls to, say, 45 degrees? The plants are injured because tomatoes don't like anything below 50. So they're injured, but hopefully they recover during the day. But, you know, anyway, symptoms are usually around room temperature. Why is that? Why do these chilling injury symptoms develop upon room temperature, upon raising the temperature? Well, usually they occur because there's some kind of cellular damage done, and as you warm them up, then you see these excessive water loss because of the semi-permeability of the membranes have been compromised. And the post-chilling environment can mitigate or accentuate the symptom development. Oftentimes, the best preventive measure for chilling is to rapidly use the commodity. You can raise the humidity to prevent symptom development, things like this. So here we see chilling and shelf life. Here is temperature, percent of possible shelf life, and shelf life of a non-chilling sensitive commodity, like celery, will increase as the temperature decreases. Again, not a linear function, but a quadratic function. So the lower the temperature, the more increase you get. So the slope here is much steeper than the slope there. Okay, a chilling sensitive commodity will follow the same trajectory until it hits the chilling threshold, at which the injury starts to increase and the shelf life then decreases over time. Notice that sometimes at low temperatures, it doesn't go to zero like that. There's this effect here at low temperatures where there's not exactly a time temperature correlation. Here's tomato fruit, 2 weeks at 20 degrees centigrade, 2 weeks at 20 degrees Celsius after being held at these different temperatures. Yeah. Okay. So they were chilled at 0 to 10 degrees Celsius, and as you can see, if you hold them at too cold a temperature, they never develop color, or they develop abnormal color. If you hold them at too high a temperature, you also develop abnormal temperature. The lycopene isn't synthesized very well. It's mainly the carotenoids. But if you hold them at just the right temperature, then you get, it's like Goldilocks, right? Just the right temperature, you get nice quality tomatoes. Chilling injury, high temperature injury, but just right. Other symptoms are browning in this anthurium. There we go. So you get browning. That's often a symptom of chilling injury. Here is avocados. You see vascular browning occurring, some browning of the flesh, but mainly vascular browning, usually caused by oxidation of phenolic compounds that occur in the tissue. Another major symptom of chilling injury is surface pitting. You see how the pits develop here because of excessive water loss. You counter that by increasing the humidity or putting them into a barrier bag so they have a very high humidity around them. And then grapefruit are also chilling sensitive, and you can see a progression here with greater peel darkening. Dracaena, growing out in the field, has injury on it. So if you store Dracaena or you ship Dracaena, you have to realize that these are chilling sensitive commodities and they will suffer necrosis. Also realize that this is a good example showing that the more meristematic, the younger tissue, is more susceptible to chilling injury than is the more mature tissue. In cucumbers, you have the chilling injury, you'd have sunken areas on the peel, and then after that, then you have an attack by a specific pathogen. So usually you can tell where the tissue has been chilled by the pathogen that's attacking it. Alternaria attacks tomatoes that have been chilled, and I forget what this exactly is here, but it's usually characteristic of commodities suffering chilling injury. And here we have string beans, and you see the darkening blotches on the beans. Have you seen this before? Good, good, good. Repetition is good. Okay. Bananas, so controlled and chilled. Do you see this anywhere? Good. Because every couple of weeks I go to when we go to Walmart to buy some stuff, I look at the bananas and they are as gray as my hair. They're just amazing, you know, you think that they don't have to chill the darn things. But anyway, so graying of the peel and this browning of the vascular tissue. The vascular tissue is meristematically active, or not, it's physiologically active tissue. It produces a lot of phenolic compounds and you get this peel browning, the vascular browning. Yeah, more discoloration. You know, so sometimes it's hard to stand there next to the banana counter and somebody comes up and says, "Oh, I think I'll buy some bananas." You know, it's hard to say, "Wait a second, these are chilled bananas." Okay, so brown spot in pineapple. Pineapple is also chilling sensitive. Again, it's a tropical commodity. And it's called the endogenous brown spot. And you see here, these are individual flowers, the individual little flowers that make up the pineapple. And you can see how they are affected by chilling. So here is holding it at 7.2 degrees Celsius, and you hold it at a little colder, you get a little bit of browning, you hold it at 3 degrees, and you get all this really brown tissue. And you can see this every so often in buying stuff. Okay. Internal breakdown of stone fruit. So stone fruit has this development of mealiness. Internal breakdown occurs at these temperatures, but not at these. Okay, so you can use that. Cultivars, different susceptibilities. Here you have different cultivars of plums, all these different cultivars. These are the market life in weeks, and you notice there are, these are chilling sensitive. and these are chilling resistant. So there are different cultivars, even within like plums, and you can select the right cultivar to be chilling resistant. So how do you prevent chilling injury? Conditioning. So here you have these peaches, 100% mealy if you hold them for 5 days at 20 degrees Celsius. If you hold them at 0 degrees Celsius for 20 days, you get 40% mealy. Well, what if you do this? What if you hold them at 20 degrees for 48 hours? Kind of conditioning them, and then you hold them at 5 days at 20 degrees, or 5 degrees Celsius for 20 days. So here's 20 days, 20 days, 20 days, but you give them two days at 20 degrees Celsius, and you notice that there's 0% mealiness. So these kind of conditioning treatments can prevent the expression of some of these disorders. So there's diurnal changes in chilling sensitivity. They change during the day. Commodities harvested during the heat of the day are more susceptible than commodities harvested during the cool part of the day. All right, changes can be duplicated in the environment. So you can take the plasticity of the commodity and enforce this by different conditioning treatments. How do you prevent chilling injury? Well, we don't know whether we are preventing the symptoms or the injury, but you can do it with controlled atmospheres, or don't chill, there you go, controlled atmospheres, but oftentimes this is relatively expensive for commodities. Or you can condition them. You can do high temperature conditioning, low temperature, or intermittent warming. Intermittent warming is a really interesting idea, but it's expensive because of the energy costs. Yes?
Why is the commodity harvested in the heat of the day more sensitive to chill?
The idea is that the membranes within the commodity, the membranes around the cell, right, are composed of certain fatty acids, phospholipids. And the fluidity of these varies during the day. The cell wants to maintain the same fluidity in the cell membrane. And the membranes turn over relatively rapidly, about every 6 hours. So they're not static. They're continually being degraded and resynthesized. So if you're holding them at a high temperature, the membranes are made up of fatty acids in the phospholipids, which tend to have a higher point at which they solidify, higher temperature at which they solidify. So they're more chilling sensitive, okay? Because you don't have to drop the temperature as low for them to solidify. If you harvest them when they're cool, or you hold them in a refrigerated environment for a while, the membranes will then revert to a different composition, and they will undergo phase transition at a lower temperature. So they'll be more chilling resistant. So it has to do with that. So you can, and also there's something about the storage of different carbohydrates. Flour is harvested in the late afternoon when they have a higher carbohydrate content, will be more resistant to chilling than those harvested in the morning when they've used up all their carbohydrates during the day. Well, that's the last slide. Any other questions?